Esther, thank you so much for joining us and for your willingness to be our first person today. We have just a short period, an hour, and I know you have so much to share with us, so we'll get started.
Okay.
You were very young when your parents sent you to England, and although you were too young to be able to tell us firsthand about life in Germany for your family at that time, perhaps you can give us a sense of what life was like for your parents in Adelsheim and for your family during the time before Kristallnacht and your parents' decision to send their daughters away to safety in England. Tell us about those early years as best you can.
Okay, well, I was 2 when I left, so I clearly don't know this from personal remembrance. My family consisted, as you saw in the picture, there were 5 children and my mother and father. My father had lost a leg in the First World War. He had been trained to be a baker, which he couldn't do with just one leg. So he traded grain and arranged sales of animals to the local farmers. My mother helped him because he had trouble with the cart. It's kind of hard now to think about. At that time, they were using carts. In the year that I was born, there actually was a court case that somebody was suing my father and my mother that my father had sold them a cow that wasn't good. So they actually lost their business the year that I was born, which was happening to Jews all over Germany. So my sisters the 3 older sisters could no longer go to school in Adelsheim, which is a very small place. It's still a small place. It has 1 traffic light.
To this day?
To this day. So they had gone first to live with my mother's sisters to go to school in Heilbronn, and then from there they went to Aachen. So one of the things that I've found out recently, so I'm going to contradict something Bill said, my aunts actually arranged for my sisters to leave on the Kindertransport. But my sisters had been living in Aachen with my aunts. My brother and I were still in Adelsheim with my parents. Adelsheim had a very small Jewish community, but my family had moved there from another small Jewish community because there were enough men to form a minyan and to hold services. The actual Rosenfeld family, my father's family, had been in that area 200 years. They were longtime residents of that area. My mother came from another place called Rexingen, and I really don't know as much about my mother at all.
Esther, how large of an extended family did you have?
Both my parents were one of 10 siblings, so there was an enormous family, actually.
So many cousins and aunts and uncles. Yep.
Many.
Yeah.
Two of my uncles and one of my aunts was in the United States by then, and one aunt was in England, and we'll talk about that later.
What was the age range of your siblings?
My older sister, Bertel, who's the only one who's still alive, is 12 years older than I am, and I was the youngest. Bertel tells me I was born at home, because that's what happened then. She said she had to wake up in the middle of the night because I was born, and then she tells me how she'd wash my diapers. Like, what does she want me to do, thank her? I don't know.
Just reminding you.
Just reminding me.
Kristallnacht, which took place November 9th through 10th, 1938, convinced many German Jews, including your parents, that life under the Nazis had become intolerable and would get worse. Do you know much about the impact of Kristallnacht immediately on your family? Do you know what it meant for your family?
Well, I know what happened to my sisters, and I know kind of what happened to my parents. My sisters were living, as I said, in Aachen, and they had walked off to school because you didn't know everything that was happening then. And they saw the synagogue burning.
So this was that morning, the morning of the 10th of November.
The 10th. So they were told to go home and to go home. The thing that I don't understand, my oldest sister, Bertel, said, well, we were just children. We didn't exactly know what was going on. Well, my sister Bertel is a smart woman, so she must have been a smart kid. How could she not have known? I don't understand it. And my other two sisters really didn't talk about it a lot. So something that I read just recently that I hadn't read, I just read it yesterday actually, my aunts in Aachen arranged for my sisters to go on the Kindertransport.
Up to that point, you thought your parents had
I
arranged
thought
it,
my
right?
parents
And
had,
this
which-
as of yesterday.
Yeah, as of yesterday.
Wow.
I mean, that's the
Wow.
thing about all this. I am always finding out, and my family is always finding out things we didn't know. So, I mean, the only story I ever heard about it, Bertel telling me her ears were pierced the night before she left because it prevented her eyes from deteriorating. My sisters never talked about the actual trip, except for Edie, who mentioned getting food when they crossed out of Germany, but I never really heard anything else from them about the actual trip. And considering Bertel was 13 and Edie was 11 and Ruth, I think, was 7 or 8, I don't know that I don't know why. But back in Adelsheim, I know what happened there, and I have to tell you how I know this. There's a man in Adelsheim who, when people want to know what happened to their families, the Jewish families, or what their life was like, they contact this man, Reinhard Lochwin. He was a high school teacher in Adelsheim, not from Adelsheim, but that's where he was. And he inherited this position from a man who actually had known my parents, but then that man got too old and he gave it over to Reinhard. And Reinhard has gotten very involved in the Jewish history of Adelsheim.
And he's not Jewish, though, is he?
He's not Jewish. His father was a Nazi. And he said his mother is concerned that his getting so involved will make him go mad, but he hasn't gone mad. But I wrote to him to ask him because somebody asked me what happened in Adelsheim. I had no way of knowing. We weren't there. But apparently people came, they went from villages to villages destroying things, and they came to Adelsheim. 2 or 3 people from Adelsheim joined them. They burned the synagogue, they took the Torahs and they burned those, and they did arrest and beat up some of the men. Now, my parents lived in a house that was off the main road and nothing happened to them, at least that's what I know. Mm-hmm. So, and then they went on to the next village. And we had an aunt, the aunt that I talked about, my mother's sister in London. She had gone to London earlier and worked as a domestic because that was a job you could do if you were an immigrant. Mm-hmm. So she did arrange places for my sisters to go.
Your aunt had done that, right?
My aunt had done that.
So after Kristallnacht, which was November of 1938, so in early 1939, your parents and your aunts begin making plans to have you go to England, to go on a Kindertransport. Tell us what a Kindertransport was.
Well, Kinder's children transport was a train. But when the war broke out, there was a conference to see if any nations would be willing to take in refugees, and actually England was the only place that did. Mm-hmm. The Jewish community and some Christian groups, Friends, I don't know which other groups, went to Parliament and asked them if they would be willing to take children, and they were willing to take unaccompanied children with the understanding...
So no parents, no adults?
No parents, no adults. With the understanding that after this unpleasantness was finished, these children would return to their parents and be gone. Mm-hmm. There was a fee, a £50 fee, I don't know what that's worth now, but it was quite a bit, that had to be paid. And these people tried to find homes, or children were sent to hostels, lived in group homes. So luckily for my sisters, my aunt knew enough people to find homes.
Because she was there in London already.
She was in London. Yeah. And in the same thing that I read yesterday, they were saying the children who had places to go went to London, and the children who didn't went to Dover, someplace else, and then they went to these homes.
You didn't go with your 3 sisters. You went separately from them. So they went first. Why do you think that was?
Well, they went in March of 1939. Right. And I left in June of 1939.
So several months later.
There are many things about my being sent that I don't know. My brother was older than me. Why wasn't he sent? Why did they send me? I would say because he was the only boy and boys were very special, but I don't really know. And as much as you can find out so much information these days, haven't been able to find out how I got from Adelsheim to the train and who took care of me. Clearly, at 2 years old, somebody did. So I don't know that at all. But I went in June, as I said, and the Society of Friends found a placement for me.
And friends associated with the Quakers, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I lived in a place called Thorpe, which was a little tiny hamlet outside of Norwich, which is a cathedral city in England. My foster father worked in a shoe factory, and the man who ran the shoe...
Before we get to that, just a couple more questions.
Okay.
You said there was a fee, like a 50-pound fee, which was a lot of money. Were there other costs, to your knowledge, associated with being sent on the Kindertransport?
Not that I know of, but clearly you had to be able to get there.
Right.
And I don't know...
Get passage on a train, plus make it to
I don't
England.
know about that.
And
I'll
clear,
have to look that up.
And as you were saying, here you are, you're 2 years old, and you're accompanied by somebody on a train. And you shared with me, there was a film from 2007, I think, that Into the Arms of Strangers, that I believe does a pretty good job of...
Yeah, it really is a good movie. It follows 10 different people who were either on the Kindertransport, one woman who was pulled off.
It's a documentary,
It's
right?
a documentary. It's really quite interesting if you can get it from your library or Netflix.
With your sisters going in March, they don't remember what the actual Kindertransport was like for them, the trip, to your knowledge?
2 of them are dead.
Right. But
and my other
as
sisters,
you talked over the years,
they never really talked about it. I don't know if they talked amongst themselves and didn't tell me. I mean, I really didn't hear much about it. You could take very limited, it wasn't such a little suitcase. I mean, Bertel had the suitcase she had taken, which is now in the museum. And you could take some clothes and that, but other than that, they really never talked about it. It's like a mystery in the family. Right. In fact, they never talked about anything. We'll talk about that later. It was very quiet.
So with your sisters going in March, they arrived, and I believe they went to separate homes. So they were separated once they hit London. What do you know about where they went?
Okay, Bertel, my oldest, went to live with a couple who had a place in Scotland. And in fact, Bertel told me they were on the train going to Scotland when war was declared.
So September 1, 1939.
So Bertel lived with them in Scotland. She went to school for a little bit, but when she was 16, she returned to London to live with my aunt and go to work. And she told me at a later date, when she was older and been living in London, a policeman knocked on the door and asked her, "Do you know this man?" She said, "I don't know that man." Well, it turned out her foster father was a spy for Germany, and when they'd been up in Scotland, he'd been spying for the Germans. So
what a great cover. You're a foster home for a Jewish child,
right?
And you're a spy for the Nazis.
Very good cover.
Yeah.
Edie lived with a family in London, and then when the war broke out, children were sent out of London, and she then went to live with a Jewish family in the countryside, and she always said they treated her like a slave. She was a very unhappy person there. And when she got old enough, she joined the Women's Army, and she was in the Army in England.
In the British Army, right?
Yeah.
And maybe we'll jump ahead a little bit because you brought that up. Once she joined the Army, later, after the war, she got stationed in Germany, right?
She did.
And went to Adelsheim,
She
right?
went to Adelsheim to get our birth certificates. And she apparently was walking down the street, and somebody looked at her and said in German, "Oh, you must be Adolf, my father. Adolf's daughter." I mean, they recognized her. Very interesting. The other interesting thing about the birth certificates, all girls' birth certificates had Sarah added to the name, so I was Esther Sarah, which was on the tag. And all boys had Israel added to their tag. And then later on, much later, I got another birth certificate, and the Sarah's gone, thank goodness. And Ruth went she lived with a doctor in London, a doctor and his family. And then when she was sent from London, she lived with another family, the Websters, and I never really heard much about the Websters either. And she, for some reason, landed up in a hostel. The one thing Ruth said about the hostel was because she wouldn't do her Hebrew lessons that were sent to her. I don't think that's why she landed up in the hostel, but I don't know. So she was just leaving the hostel when we came to this country. And then she went to high school here.
Do you know if during the time, including the time when you went to Norwich, all in different parts of England, not just in different homes, was there any communication between the siblings during that time?
Well, my aunt knew where we all were.
Okay.
I remember my sisters visiting, but in looking back, I'm pretty sure it was after the war that you couldn't really move around during the war.
Okay. As you shared with us a moment ago, your brother Herman didn't go. He stayed behind with your parents. Tell us what you can about what happened to Herman and what happened to your parents. What do you know about that?
Okay, apparently, much of the stuff I know about Herman, we found out very recently. The museum has a new exhibit about the U.S. response to the Holocaust.
Yeah, in fact, it opens officially in a couple of weeks, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So when the historians were doing research, they found a picture of my brother when he came to this country. And from that picture, because I met someone else who was doing research, the connection was made, and she found out a lot of stuff about my brother. But anyhow, my parents, all the Jews in Baden were sent to France. They were deported in October of 1940. It was the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. And my brother by then was not living at home because he was living somewhere else to go to school, and he was home for the holiday. It was very common for these actions against the Jews to happen on Jewish holidays. It's the way it was done. So my parents and my brother were sent to Gurs, which is in France. My father had a wooden leg, which I mentioned before. Apparently his wooden leg didn't go with him, because I have copies of letters from the mayor of Adelsheim telling whoever took his leg to give it back, because the camp they went to was a work camp.
Gurs was a work camp in France.
Yeah,
in France.
And one of my aunts was there. But there was an organization called OSE that took kids out of the camps and provided them with schooling and some education and probably more food than they got in the camp. So just recently we have learned that Herman was in this camp, in this school, and which one he was in, which we didn't know until the last year or two. So in 1941, 1,000 children were allowed into the United States, and he came to the United States.
As part of that group of 1,000
As part of
kids.
that group of 1,000 children. And apparently there was a picture in the paper, and some family members saw the picture and got connected with Herman. But also just recently, I got a list, and I'm not sure where it came from. It talks about the expenses involved in getting Herman from New York to here. So it's just interesting. My parents stayed in Gurs, and in 1942, when the killing started in full force and people were being deported to be murdered, my parents were sent to Auschwitz August 14th, 1942, and they were murdered immediately upon their arrival.
And you, of course, you didn't know this at the time, but when you learned this, you learned great details, including the convoy number that they were on. That's why you know the exact date.
There's a book published by someone in France. It lists all the convoys, the names of the people, when they were born, what village they came, well, where they came. They didn't all come from villages. And then what happened to them. So Bertel actually had known they had died because she was sending money. I mean, here she was, 16, 17, 18. They needed money in the camp, which I didn't know as a kid. And she got back the money from the Red Cross, so she knew. Mm-hmm. And I was not a questioning child. I didn't really know that. And I'll get to that when we come here. Can I get back to...
before your experience with the Harrisons, you, with your parents in Germany still, Bertel at least, did hear from them for a while, mm-hmm. and you have some family letters. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. In the 1980s, there started to be a lot of information on television, the newspaper. People were beginning to really talk about it. And Bertel just said, "Oh, I've got some letters from my mother." And my father wrote 3 lines on the bottom. Of course, they were in German. I took German in high school and college. I really can't speak it. But my husband had them translated where he worked. And that's really all I know about my mother. Mm-hmm. So my mother at the beginning expected to get out and to join us. But she wrote to Bertel, who was not living with us, was a teenager, make sure your siblings are polite, do the homework.
And here you are living in places all over separately. Yeah.
Wash behind their ears, thank the people, just the things that mothers tell you to do.
Right.
And always a belief in God. She always believed in God. There's another letter where she knows that Herman has come to the United States, and she talks about how pleased she is that he's living with this uncle who lived in Adelsheim before he came here, and he has a cousin who just loves having this little brother. Not sure about that. Mm-hmm. And then there's another letter, and my mother wasn't thin. You saw that on the picture. There was a lot of her. Telling Bertel to save her clothes because she'd gotten so thin she'd be able to wear them. Mm-hmm. I mean, just unbelievable. The beginning letters are spaced, punctuation. The last one, it runs together. Mm-hmm. So by the end, she was pretty sure she wasn't going to get out. Yeah. But it was interesting to read. Bertel said there were more letters, but in all the moving around, they had been
One of the
lost.
things you said to me is you can really see the despair growing in these mm-hmm. letters.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, they stopped.
Yeah. I mean, me reading the letters, that was the first time I realized you needed money in the camps.
Right.
And I didn't know that.
So when you got to England, you ended up in this little village, living with the Harrisons.
Well, Norwich is a big place. Thorpe's a little place.
And you stayed with the Harrisons until 1947, so for 8 of the first 10 years of your life. Tell us what you recall about your life with the Harrisons, both during the war and then for that period of time after the war.
Okay, just to go back, because you asked me about communication. My mother knew where I was going, and she had written to Auntie Dot, my foster mother, so and Auntie Dot kept the letters, so I have them. So she wrote a letter telling her about me and that things that I was scared of and that kind of thing. And Auntie Dot answered, and then there's another postcard, mm-hmm. which I think it must have been a relief to at least know where I was going. And the Harrisons were deeply religious and really believed God would look out. I mean, to send all your children to strangers, I can't imagine doing it. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, when I first got there, I had scarlet fever and was quarantined, but Alan used to play with me through the window. He's 7 years older than me, and I loved Alan from the start.
Was he their only child?
He's their only child. Yeah. Exactly the same age as my sister Ruth. Mm-hmm. I was scared of Uncle Harry. He was the mildest man you ever met. Never raised his voice, but I was scared of him. And the only thing and also loud noises. And it must have been because of things that had happened in Germany. But I lived with them. They basically spoiled me rotten. And that. But they belonged to something called a chapel. And, now in churches and synagogues, community is so important. Well, this chapel had community. They had a lot of activities.
It was a Christian.
It was a Christian community.
Yeah.
It was people who didn't do Church of England.
Okay.
So I was involved there. Did I know I was Jewish? Maybe. I don't know. I was, they had many activities. The shoe factory had trips that we went on, but I guess all that was after the war because you couldn't really do that. We had to carry a gas mask, which had to be tested. We were given milk in school and things like that. I loved school. I was a pretty good student, and they had something called the 11 plus exam, and I was just about ready to take that, which determined whether you went to an academic high school or a trade school, and that's when we came to this country. Alan was a really good big brother. I don't know how many of you had big brothers or were big brothers or sisters and were mean to your little ones, but he was not. He would take me around with me and look out for me and all that. So I was with them till I was 10.
So you're 8 years. During the war years, you mentioned that you had to have a gas mask. Do you remember or do you know of any of the other impacts in that community of the war that was taking place? It was pretty brutal.
Yeah, well, I've known other people who talked about they never had enough food. That was never true. I mean, the Harrisons grew things. We had chickens in the backyard. I remember we got rid of the chickens when rats came. Alan said that's not what happened, but who knows. I don't remember having trouble with clothes. I mean, you wore a uniform, so you didn't have to have a lot of clothes. Uncle Harry fixed my shoes. In fact, the shoes I had have been donated to the museum, and they've been fixed many times. I imagine we had blackout curtains. We had an air raid shelter in the backyard that we went into. There was an American Air Force base nearby, so there were a lot of planes, and that Alan and his buddies would collect pieces that fell off planes and all that, but I didn't do that. Wasn't a girl thing to do.
And you went to school in a little English school right there.
Yeah.
And, so
Right.
sort of having given that it was wartime, sort of a growing up English for a period of time.
I was very happy. Now, my sisters came to visit. We went once, I guess Auntie Dot took me to London, and I went to a Seder with Aunt Hannah, and I had no idea what was going on. It was long. We also went one time, all of us, and what I remember about doing is Alan and I going up and down the escalators, because the stores in Norwich didn't have escalators, and that. But what's really interesting is something I just found out recently. One of the times we were in England, Auntie Dot gave me a lot of pictures. And she gave me a picture of me with the beefeater, the guards at the... And I'd never looked on the back of it. Well, I looked on the back of it this time, and it said, going to London to see if there's a place on a ship. I never knew that. To me, when I left, it was a big surprise. But apparently...
There had been some work to plan it. Yeah.
And I must have, because since then, you can get records from different places, and Bloomsbury House was the place that looked after the refugees. And I've gotten records from there, and it talks about money for the passport and money for some shot. None of this I knew. I mean, I guess the Harrisons didn't tell me these things. The other thing that I have that Auntie Dot gave me, she had written to my uncle here, the uncle that my brother was living, to see if they could keep me, which I would have been very happy about. And my uncle wrote back and saying, no, the family needed to be together. That's what my parents wanted, and all this kind of stuff. It was a pretty nice letter from my uncle, actually. But I was not a questioning kid. I think if you've been sent from one place and told you're going to be someplace else, you learn you don't ask questions. You just, or at least that's what I learned. So in November of 1947.
Before we turn there, just one more question. So the war ended in May of 1945, and you would live in England for another 2 years with the Harrisons. Do you remember how life changed for you, if at all, once the war was over? Was anything different that you recall?
I don't really remember, but I guess the bombing stopped and all that
stopped.
kind of stuff. But,
Yeah.
food was still scarce, clothes, all those things were still true.
Rationing continued for many years in England.
Right,
Yeah.
so none of that changed. And I don't, I'm very good at blocking out things that happened.
So 1947, that's when you learn, however long it had been planned, you learn that you are now going to be leaving the Harrisons.
Yeah, the Harrisons did not have a telephone. Well, not too many people did.
Right.
So Bertel called the police in Norwich, and they came to the door and told the Harrisons they had to take me to London the next day. So Alan and Auntie Dot went with me. Uncle Harry couldn't take off work. And they took me to London, handed me over. I was another package. And they did go to see the ship off, actually. Alan was supposed to receive a big award that day, which he didn't because he wasn't there to do it. So we sailed on the Queen Mary. Well, that might sound fancy, but it'd been a troop ship. It wasn't fancy. Mm-hmm. They had a strike there was somebody from the royal family on the ship, and whoever was having the strike thought that would be a good day. Luckily, Bertel had a boyfriend who was a butcher, and he'd given her a sausage, and my aunt had given us bread, so we didn't starve. But we left. I was very seasick. I don't think Bertel was. What I didn't learn until much later, Bertel didn't want to leave either. But we were leaving. My sister Ruth...
So why did you leave? Bertel was sort of basically taking care of everybody. It sounds like she must have done a lot of the arranging.
Well, Bloomsbury House did the arrangement and arranged it. My mother had said that's what we were to do. Also, if you remember, the Kindertransport said we weren't supposed to stay there.
Right. And so your mother had, in one of those early letters, had said, get to the United States eventually?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
I lost what I was going to
So,
say.
Why the United States?
Because we had uncles here.
Because you had uncles here.
We had
okay.
uncles here. My brother was here by then.
Okay.
So we came to the United States.
Do you remember what it was like for you? 80 your first 10 years with the Harrisons, and now you're told, with somebody coming to the door saying you got to go to London tomorrow.
It was a big shock.
It was a big shock.
Yeah. And Alan tells me his mother's hair turned white overnight, and yet she knew it was going to happen. So we came to the United States. 2 uncles met us in New York. One was the uncle where my brother was living, and he had lived in Adelsheim, so Bertel knew him. The other was an uncle who'd married my aunt. And we came to the United States. Now, Ruth had come the week before. We lived with another aunt and uncle in town. That was the worst time in my life, actually, which is kind of interesting because if you get a chance to see the Kindertransport movie, Into the Arms of Strangers, many of the people are very unhappy because they are living with families that didn't love them right away. Why would they think families are going to love a stranger anyhow? Or they had to do chores which they'd never done in Germany and things like that. To me, coming to the U.S. was like that. The Harrisons were soft-spoken. They never yelled. They didn't drink. They didn't play cards. They didn't go to the movies. They didn't wear makeup. Came to this country. We lived in a big house on North Capitol Street, which isn't far from here. There was another immigrant family, my aunt, my uncle, my aunt's mother, and 2 cousins. So there were a lot of people in this house. My aunt was mentally ill. Nowadays they have medication, but she would do things like come in and pull the sheets off the bed at 5 in the morning to wash them, keep the food till it was bad. I mean, I threw my lunch away every day on the way to school because the food was bad. My uncle had a bad temper. He used to throw things, furniture and stuff.
So as you're describing, you've come from this household where it's calm and quiet and nurturing, and very nurturing, right?
They were nurturing in their way. It was just a very strange way. So I went to a school. The schools in England at that time were better than the schools here, so I didn't learn anything much. But I had a teacher.
You didn't learn much when you got to the United
Here.
States? Okay.
But I had, except diagramming. I don't know if you had to diagram in English, but I never saw the point of it. We didn't do that in England.
And this is from a former educator.
But, so I had a new religion, a new family, a new kind of school. She made fun of my English because some of the words were different. Everything was different. And a new family, because while I knew my sisters, I hadn't lived with them.
Right, right.
So it wasn't the best arrangement. My uncle once dragged me kicking and fussing to the movies. We went to see The Wizard of Oz.
So at some point, you actually ended up living with your sisters.
I did. So we were there when Edith came over. Once Edith had a job and Bertle had a job.
Because she'd been in the British Army.
Yeah,
so
she came over the day Truman was elected, so they didn't pay much attention to her because there was an election. But anyhow, after they had jobs, my sisters got an apartment. They took me with them, which, if you think about it, they were two young women in a new country trying to make a go of it. They could have left me with my aunt and uncle, but they didn't. So we lived in an apartment. I went to school. Sometimes they were dating people who were my teachers, but I lived with them. I graduated from high school when I was 16, not because I'm very bright, but just because I'd gone to school in England. And it never occurred to me I couldn't go to college. My sisters never said, well, now you can go to work. Well, which was probably good. I failed typing. But I went to the University of Illinois and lived the middle of us. Ruth had been married by then, so I lived with them. My brother-in-law was going to work on his PhD. And I lived with them and went to school, studied to be a teacher, got my degree. Luckily, in one of my classes, I found out you could get your citizenship when you were 18, because at that time, you couldn't teach in public schools in Maryland unless you were a citizen. So I got my citizenship the day after Ike was elected, I think. And I came and I taught for many years. I loved teaching. I was pretty good at it, too. I taught for 3 years, and then I got married, I got married my second year of teaching, and then we had 2 children. I stayed home for 9 years, then I went back to teaching, and I taught for 29 years altogether.
Esther, talk to us a little bit about the Harrisons, because it didn't end with you coming here.
No.
Talk to us about your relationship.
My sisters were
here.
very wise people. They made me write to them regularly. And in 1964, 54, no, maybe it was 64, Alan came over as an exchange teacher, and that was really nice. And then the summer when he finished that, we brought the Harrisons over, and they stayed with us for a while. It was very brave for them. I mean, they weren't real modern people, but they got on this plane and came here. We went to the beach, which was an unfortunate beach, because we'd asked Alan, he was teaching in New Jersey, to find a place for us. He found a place. I hope nobody's from Tom's River. This was in Tom's River. They have a lot of mosquitoes in Tom's River. It's not a good place to go. But we had a great time, and then the Harrisons went back. We visited the Harrisons, Fred, the girls, and I. I mean, the Harrisons were sort of like grandparents. My kids knew they weren't their grandparents. Alan was always Alan. He was never Uncle Alan. He was always just Alan. And we went back and forth a couple of times. Deborah and Judy went to visit once or twice by themselves. Alan came here pretty regularly. And when Auntie Dot died, Uncle Harry would come and spend 6 weeks in the summer with Fred and I. And what was really interesting, after his father died, he found out from a cousin that his grandfather was from the Ukraine and was Jewish. Uncle Harry had loved going to synagogue, so maybe there was some connection there.
But that was a recent,
well,
I mean, relatively speaking.
Relatively speaking.
Yeah.
So my foster parents are dead. Alan and I, we go back. He used to visit. He's a little old for that now. I go there. Yeah. And he's pretty special to me. I mean, my brother was too, but he was a brother also. And Fred considered him like a brother too. Well, a brother-in-law.
And as you said, you've been back to England to visit them. What about going to Germany?
Okay. In the late 1980s, I had this great need to find out where I came from, that I didn't hatch out of an egg. So Bertel and her husband, and Fred and I were going to go back to Adelsheim. Well, in the meantime, Morris had a heart attack and couldn't go. So Bertel wrote a letter in German to them saying we were coming. And Fred and I went off to Germany. When we got there, the whole town, there was nobody around. It was like it was dead. But eventually we found somebody, and they sent us to the town hall where they couldn't find the letter. They didn't speak English, we didn't speak German, but the deputy mayor's wife spoke English. So we made arrangements to meet the next day, and they said, well, where are you staying? I said, well, someplace here. And they wanted me to go out of town. I said, no, you sent me away once, I'm staying this time. And we stayed in this, it was sort of like a bed and breakfast. Well, they had meals, so we stayed there. I had such nightmares that night. I thought the Nazis were coming up to get me. We ate in the thing. I don't know what we were eating, but the people there kind of knew who we were. We could tell they were talking about us. And then the next day, Mr. Wedderhahn, who had actually known my parents, and he was the man who originally answered questions and wrote back, we went on a tour. My sisters had told me a couple of places to see. Apparently, when they baked the challah on Friday nights, there was a community bakery, and somebody had to take the loaf down. Well, Edith once dropped it in the little stream, so I knew what stream to look for. They showed us the outside of the house.
The family home.
The family home. And while it was big, apparently on the second floor other people lived on. And we went to the cemetery. There's another little town, and in between the two towns there's a cemetery that was really pretty well taken care of. It was off the path, so it wasn't where people might see it to vandalize. So we did see everything. There's a little museum there that's only open every other Sunday or something, but they opened it for us, and they had a section about the Jews. I did not feel like I was going home. It had no memories for me, but I had seen it, and I was glad that I went.
If I remember right, you encountered some people who acknowledged that they knew your family.
No, only Mr. Wedderhahn, not that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that you have
Yeah.
encountered people, yeah.
So at some point, Bertel and Morris decided to go, and by that time, Reinhardt was the person doing the introductions.
He's the fellow from the town
Yeah.
who's, yeah.
They actually stayed at the house of my other daughter's in-laws' family that lived close by. But they went and they saw everything, but they became friendly with this man, Reinhardt. And in 2000, he wrote to Bertel, or actually emailed, to say he was planning a commemorative of the deportation of the Jews. And Bertel and I looked at each other and said, you gotta have some Jews there, let's go. So we did go, and Renee came with us, my brother's oldest daughter. I have to backtrack a little bit. At some point, Bertel had said, I wonder if there's anybody in Rexingen where our mother came from. So I put something on, anybody from Rexingen, and somebody answered. Well, it turned out this was a young man going to American U, which is in town here. And Bertel said, I want to meet him, and made arrangements. I said, Bertel, you can't go meet a strange man by yourself. So her husband went with her. But we became friendly with this Tim guy. And he had said we could go to Rexingen and stay with his parents. So on the way to go to this commemoration, we went to Rexingen. We saw the cemetery where a lot of my maternal grandparents and people were born and buried, not born. So we went there, we saw some of the places in Rexingen, but I don't know as much about my mother's family or about Rexingen. There is a book about the cemetery, about the Jews buried in that cemetery that we have, Reinhardt sent us a copy. But after the man did the book about the Jews, there's a book about the Crusaders who are buried in the same cemetery. So it's interesting. But then we went to Adelsheim, and that's where we met people who knew and that Bertel remembered. She was taught, the first day with the Bertel translator told me what was going on. But she met people that she'd been in first grade with when she could still go to school, and somebody had died and they were busy, just like if you go to a reunion. They were talking about what they die and all this. And then somebody who was a neighbor said, oh, my father used to take food to your parents because Jews didn't get the coupons for food like the rest of the Germans. And he said, my mother was very concerned because if he'd been caught, something would have happened to us. And I said to Bertel, do you think this is true? Because a lot of stories like that happen afterwards. People talk about what they did. But Bertel said, yes, she remembered in some letter her mother had told her that. And then
that acknowledged these folks had done that? Okay.
And someone else had exchanged, they had sold them things they had in the house and had exchanged food. And again, Bertel said, so it was an interesting trip. We got to go up in the house where my parents had lived. Well, it had been totally renovated. And the thing that was interesting, they had a son who was the same age as my oldest grandson. And we went upstairs. He had all the same toys, you know, Legos and all those, but they were very neat, unlike the ones at my grandson's, which were all over.
There's a couple, speaking of neat, I've got a question for you. I want to ask a couple more questions before we turn to our audience.
Okay.
You had shared with me that at some point you learned about an inventory that was done of the property inside your parents' house. Will you say a little bit about that?
At this same time when we were there with Reinhardt, he had collected some data. He had found the proclamation about the Jews having to leave, but he had found an inventory of our house. It's pages and pages and pages. It even includes rags. I mean, every little thing. Bertel looked at it and said, oh, but we had a China doll in the living room that we weren't allowed to play with. That was not on the inventory. Clearly, it had disappeared.
Right. So this was done evidently, you know, as your parents were being sent to the
and
camp.
then apparently these items were then sold to pay off to go to the government.
Right. And when you described it to me, you said the inventory was so detailed about their property, it mentioned a hard-boiled egg.
Yeah,
that was in the refrigerator.
It had everything in it.
Yeah.
It's pages and pages. Reinhardt had this ceremony, which was all in German, so I didn't really understand it. There was also a police outside and a neo-Nazi. It was, you know, but it seemed pretty moving, even in German. And then when I came home, I had it all translated, and that's how it done.
My last question for you, Esther, is, and if you don't mind me asking this, you clearly experienced a huge amount of upheaval earlier in your life, being uprooted from your parents, sent to a foreign country with a different family, then you were uprooted from that family and brought here. What is the impact? Is there an impact on you in your later life? What do you think about that?
Definitely. I often feel an outsider, and I think because so often I was an outsider, and I think it's also, I think I mentioned that I forget, I sort of can close off an area of my life, or I keep the people that I know in this place. I'm not good at intermingling, and I think it is directly from that. Yeah.
All right. If you don't mind, I think we have a few minutes to turn to our audience to see if they have some questions before we close the program in a few minutes. We have 2 mics, one in each aisle. We ask that if you have a question, you go to the mic, use it. Try to make your question as brief as you can. I'll repeat it just to be sure that we got it right and that everybody in the room hears it. So if you don't, I have many, many more questions I can ask, but I'm hoping that, and here comes a brave soul right off the bat. That's great.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been very interesting. You mentioned early on that you have a lot of extended family. Both your parents had 9 siblings each. How much do you know, or have you been able to trace of what happened to any of them?
That's just so everybody hears it. The question was, what do you know about what happened to your very large extended family?
Well, as I mentioned before, Reinhardt's gotten very involved, and he's made this big family tree, and he has traced I think both sides. What happened to them, and most of them landed up going to concentration camps and being killed. The thing for me, I've never heard stories about any of these people. It doesn't mean a lot to me. I mean, I'm glad to know it, but I don't feel connected to it. But I do know what happened to most of them. Yes.
Did any survive that you know of?
I think one uncle, but he was married to a non-Jew, so that may be why. The ones that were here were here.
Right.
I have a cousin in London who was also on the Kindertransport. And I think that's all.
That's it, out of this very large
Yeah.
family, okay.
But I
Thank
do have
you.
a large extended family now because Bertel has worked hard to make us a close family.
Okay. Thank you
you.
for the question. We have one over here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your story. What an amazing testimony you have. Can you tell us a little about how you have, or if you have found forgiveness, how you've dealt with that in your life over the years toward the Nazis, toward, just all that hate? Thank you.
Question is how have you dealt with the issue of forgiveness in light of all the hate and the horrors that your family went through and you went through?
Well, let me tell you, I taught in a middle school, and we had German. I didn't talk to the German teacher for 2 years. And then she was a lovely lady. This was silly. And it doesn't hurt anyone but me to be filled with hate. So I really have sort of come to grips with that. Do I forgive them? I don't understand it. I don't understand the need to pick one group of people and hate them and try to abolish them. I don't understand it. But it doesn't do me any good to hate it. It really doesn't. Do I forgive? Maybe. But I will tell you, I think I truly have had a blessed life because my parents clearly loved us to send us away. I mean, how do you do that? The Harrisons were wonderful. My sisters were wonderful. I had a great husband, and I have pretty marvelous children and extended family. So I think out of all this awfulness, good has come.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you. Thank you for those questions. Oh, we have one more. One more, okay.
I can't even see.
Thank you again for coming and sharing so much with us today. I'm curious to know, do you have any thoughts on how your experience as a displaced person and the broader lessons from the Holocaust should inform the immigration policies that we create in the United States today?
You know, I think if you don't mind, I'm gonna hold on that question.
Of course,
just because I want to keep it focused on her story, if at all possible. It's a very good question, and it might be one to ask Esther after the program when she goes up there, if you don't mind. And partly, I'm just very cognizant of the time, so thank you for that. I appreciate that. So, Esther is going to close our program in just a minute. But I want to let you know first that when she finishes the program, she's going to go up to the upstairs where she will sign copies of Echoes of Memory. So and that's also a chance to ask her some more questions or just say hi to her if that's okay. I want to thank all of you for being here. We will have first-person programs each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August. So we hope you'll come back for another program. We will be live streaming all of the programs in April as we're doing today. So you can listen to them on the web, and all of our programs end up on the museum's YouTube channel. So you can access them that way too. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. And so on that note, I'm turning back to Esther to close our program.
And I always have the same last word. I strongly believe, because of my experiences, most of us are never going to be in a position to affect thousands of people, but we can help one person at a time, and I think it's important for us to do that, to help people along the way, and I think that's my last word.
Thank you.